Welcome to this evening's author talk with Heather Morris and Claire Halliday. This is a joint event with the Latrobe Libraries, East Gippsland Shire Library and West Gippsland Libraries. And I'd just like to acknowledge my colleagues that have helped make this possible, Vicky Daddo and Emma Fawcett as well. Before we start, some housekeeping. Please keep your microphones on mute. There's a mic symbol on the bottom of your screen. Press it to off. Our preference is for you to turn off your videos too. There is a chat function, the speech bubble icon at the top of your screen, and you can ask questions using that feature. We'll have a question and answer at the end of the presentation. The session is being recorded, so you will receive a copy of the video later once we've processed that. I'd just also like to do an acknowledgement of country. I'd like to acknowledge begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands in which we meet today. I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So tonight we have Heather Morris. She is an international best-selling author. Her debut novel, Tattoo of Auschwitz, has sold more than 6 million copies around the world, and it's a sequel to Silklick's Journey. It has also been incredibly popular. Heather's first non-fiction book, Stories of Hope, was published last year. Tonight she'll be talking to us about her new best-selling novel, Three Sisters, which is rich in vivid detail and beautifully told. It will break your heart but leave you amazed and uplifted by the courage and fierce love of three sisters who promised to keep themselves alive. Claire Halliday will also be interviewing Heather. She's a freelance writer for 25 years and as an author, she has 5 of her own non-fiction books published, including Things My Mother Taught Me, Things My Father Taught Me, featuring interviews with Australian identities exploring the impact of nature versus nurture. Please welcome Heather and Anita. Please welcome Heather and Anita.
And hi, I'm not Patrick, I'm Linda. It says Patrick.
That's okay. Welcome everybody. I'm Claire Halliday, as was said before, and thank you so much to the library for making this possible. It is a collaborative effort and we appreciate the behind the scenes work that's gone into it to make this event possible. Now we are welcoming, of course, tonight the wonderful Heather Morris, but I just wanted to pick something up before that the library lady said, because the wonderful thing about you and your success, Heather, is that somebody says, oh yes, the book sold 6 million copies. And because they're a little bit out of date with that, suddenly the book sold so much more. So how many has the Tattooist of Auschwitz actually sold at the moment? Because it's a very impressive number that deserves a round of applause.
Look, thank you, Claire, and thank you very much to the Latrobe Libraries. It's delightful to be here chatting to you from Brisbane, where we're getting flooded. It's somewhere between that 8-9 million mark now. And yes, I only really hear about it sort of twice a year, so I never know how up to date I am.
And I did want to talk a little bit about each of your books tonight, The Tattooist, Silklick's Journey, Stories of Hope, but of course, mainly Three Sisters. Yeah. But I am going to go back to start with, because to me, observing, your life as an outsider, somebody who's spoken to you a few times before, and of course, read and loved your books, I love the fact that in your life, there's all these kind of sliding doors moments that have happened to you that have even made the books possible. And I'm sure there's some people in the audience tonight who perhaps have never heard you speak. And I just wanted to go back to that very first story about how you stumbled upon the meeting with Lale Sokolov that has really been the foundation of all of this. So just tell us about that moment and how that sort of sliding doors moment has really changed your life.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. It's true, folks. Things, they don't just happen to me. Of course, you've got to put yourself out there to make things happen. But there was a connection between me just simply having a cup of coffee with a friend. Here's a little life lesson. And somebody asks you to do something or meet somebody, unless you've got a good reason to say no, then don't say no, say yes. I'd been saying no to having a coffee with a friend for way too long. And when I did finally catch up with her, She just casually said to me, I have a friend whose mother has just died. His father has asked him to find somebody he could tell a story to. That person can't be Jewish. You're not Jewish. Do you want to meet him? When I asked her what his story was, she said she didn't know. And I said, well, never mind. And so for the second time, I said yes to meeting somebody who I didn't know. And a week later, I knocked on the door of Lali Sokolov, into his life, him into my life, into my family. And for 3 years, we were together, a friendship which ended up with this incredible story of his being now told in a novel format, The Tattooist of Auschwitz.
And I do have a couple of questions I'd love to ask you about the relationship you had with him, but I'll do that a bit later. I just wanted to talk about, I guess, what that led to, because it led to so much more than just The Tattooist. And one of those other sliding door moments is a moment where somebody, a family member of the 3 sisters who your new novel are named for, sees the cover of The Tattooist and it resonates with them. It makes a connection. And that leads you to be introduced to the sisters. Can you tell us about that moment?
Yes, look, just before we went live and all you folks got admitted in, we were talking about the covers of the different books that I have. And I mentioned that The Tattooist of Auschwitz is published in some 55 plus countries. And of all of those countries, only 2 have got the same cover as we have here in Australia. And that's really significant, because without that, I would not have told the story, 3 sisters. The 2 countries that have it are Brazil and Canada. Now, a man called Oded Ravik picked up a copy of the Canadian book at Toronto Airport. He lives in Toronto. And he took it to visit his mother in Israel, something to read on the plane. He left it on her coffee table a couple of days later. And his then 93-year-old mother walked past, glanced at the cover, and said to him, that must be about Lali and Gita. When he said, how could you possibly know that? And she said, look at the number on the arm of the girl. Now look at the number on my arm. They're 3 away. Your Auntie Sibby's was only 2 away. We went to school with Gita. We were on the train going to Auschwitz with Gita. And we were in Block 21 in Birkenau with Gita. When you get an email like that, and by the way, I wasn't sitting at home in my own lounge room. I was in a hotel in a small part of South Africa. After 2 or 3 emails and then a phone call with Livy, that's his mum, where she said to me, there's so much I need to tell you and I want to tell you, but I don't like talking on the telephone. Would you come and see me? So a few days later, instead of returning to Melbourne, I flew direct from Johannesburg to Tel Aviv and into the arms, into the love of Livy and her family, and Magda and her family, and Sibby's family. Yeah, cover of a book, a man picking it up on his way to read on a plane to go and visit his mum in Israel.
Now tell us about these 3 women, because I'm sure there's people in the audience who haven't yet read The 3 Sisters. We obviously know it's centered around the lives and what happens to 3 women. And you've just touched on their names now. But who are the women behind the story?
They were just 3 young girls. Well, they were even younger. The book begins when they were even younger, aged only 3, 5, and 7. They lived in a small town in Slovakia called Ranov. Now, one day their father gathered them together and got his little girls to make a promise to him, a promise that they would look after each other. They would never allow anything to separate them, that together they would be the strongest they ever could be. Now, here's a spoiler alert, folks, but I don't mind giving it away, because if you pick up the book in the library and you read the first 2 pages, you're going to read this anyway. So spoiler alert, that father made the girls make that promise to him, and he died the next day. Now, fast forward a few years, Livy, the youngest, is now 15, and she's told to report to the train station Ranov to be transported to go and work for the Germans. Her older sister, Sibby, she's 19. She finds out and she says she's not going on her own, I'm going with her. The middle sister, Magda, she was in hospital in a nearby town and knew nothing of her 2 sisters being taken away to Auschwitz. And so the story for the first sort of chunk of it is how these sisters had to survive to get back together. Two of them, the oldest and the youngest, in Auschwitz-Birkenau. And Magda, for 2.5 years back in Slovakia with her mother and grandfather, trying to find her sisters, trying to evade capture by the Germans. She didn't. They caught her, and she found herself in Auschwitz-Birkenau. And there the sisters were reunited together again to keep the promise they'd made to Papa.
Now, I love that you've mentioned that story of when they actually hear their father asking them to make that promise, because it's a very evocative scene. It comes early on in the book, as you said. And I wanted to use that scene to ask you more questions about the way that you actually do blend fact with fiction, because you write novels, yet they are so deeply rooted in real historical events, real people's lives, and real things that have happened, based, of course, on people's memories, which can differ over time and with circumstance. But using that story as an example, you paint a picture of the three girls sitting in the garden with their father, and he's telling them things and saying some things to them very precisely. But there's other little conversations between the sisters and with the mother, and you describe the garden. I just want to know, given that your stories are based on you sitting down chatting with people who have actually lived through the stories and digging into those memories, how do you, as a writer, blend what they say really happened with your own imagination in order to set that scene and have those conversations played out in more detail?
Thanks, Claire. Look, it's kind of important that I explain why my books are called fiction, not a memoir or biography. And it's the style of writing that I do. And it's the only style I know, folks, okay? So you have to forgive me here. When the two of these sisters, by the way, are still alive, they're 96 and 98 years of age. And in about 5 weeks' time, I will walk into their homes in Tel Aviv and be with them once again, now that the borders are opening up. But when they told me about their promise to their father, promise to Papa, they couldn't remember the details of where and how it happened. They just know that all their lives, every day of their lives, to this grand old age of their late 90s, their lives have been all about keeping their promise to Papa. And so I asked them, tell me about your home. And they described a very humble home of just one bedroom that they shared with their mother, the three girls and their mother. And Livy giggled and said, our grandfather slept in the broom closet. I said, was it really a broom closet? And she said, no, but it should have been. That's how big it was. And it had a small kitchen area with a table big enough for them to sit around and just 2 chairs. And that was their home. Dirt floor. No running water, electricity, fire, and wood fire in the kitchen. And then Magda started talking and she said, oh, remember the oleander tree in the backyard? Every winter it wanted to die and Mama wouldn't let it. Now, this is a woman well into her 90s describing to me what you and I know is just Mother Nature at work, that trees and many, many bushes and shrubs lose their leaves in winter. But still to this day, 98-year-old Magda thinks that that tree wanted to die and it was her mother that was keeping it alive and made it come back to life every year. So she talked about this oleander tree, and then Livy, where she piped up with, and there was a fence at the back. I remember now, it had a gate that was broken and it used to bang when the wind blew and scare me at night when I was in bed. Now I have got 2 pictures of where these girls were living, one inside and one outside. I need to write the scene that talks about them making their promise to Papa. My imagination is choosing where I was going to set that scene, and I chose to put it outside. So it may not have happened there. That part the girls can't remember. Excuse me if I call them the girls, okay? But that's when I use that phrase, I'm referring to Livia, Magda, and Sibby.
Now, with that approach to that blend of fact and fiction, can you tell us a little bit more about how you then deal with, I guess, some more serious storytelling within the book, where you've actually got scenes set in Auschwitz-Birkenau, horrible things are happening to people, things are tied into, historical events that are on record. How do you sort of then merge the fact and fiction together in Three Sisters?
It's not easy sometimes. Of course, there's the baseline that I have, which is never, ever try and fiddle with the timeline of Auschwitz-Birkenau. Now, the timeline of that period of history, 42 to 45, that's well documented. And there is no getting away from who was in the camp at what time and what was going on there. So I have that timeline. You mentioned the whole history and memory and how it can be, well, a challenge to write. It's even more of a challenge when you're telling the story of two sisters that are there and their memories are different.
Mm.
They describe things, Livy to me, because I spent a lot of time with her. And with Sibby, I got to see her on a 2-hour videotape she made for the Shoah Foundation and read what she'd written, testimonies. And she and Livy together, standing side by side, still saw and interpreted what was happening in front of their eyes differently. So it's a matter of then, okay, well, which one is more likely to be accurate, and how do I merge those two memories of the same event? Well, Livy told me I should go with Sibby, that Sibby would be the one who described things more accurately. And I think she was right. And I think with Livy, you got to remember, folks, she was a 15-year-old girl. She did not have the maturity of her older sister, and she did not have the education of her older sister. And she freely tells me time and time again that she existed there pretty much in the state of a zombie.
Now, you mentioned the Shoah Foundation, and I'm sure, well, there might be some people in the audience listening who are well aware of the powerful and important work that the Shoah Foundation has done. There's probably other people who don't recognize that name. Yet it's quite a critical component of your storytelling, going back to the Tattooist of Auschwitz, because you were able to watch a videotape recording of Gita talking with the Shoah Foundation and talking about her own experiences. Can you tell us about how that connection is made for you and what the Shoah Foundation is all about?
Some 25 plus years ago, that amazing film producer Steven Spielberg made a movie called Schindler's List, based on the even better, I think, incredible book written by Australia's own Tom Keneally, Schindler's Ark. Now, after Spielberg had made that film, he then sent around the world to every country where Holocaust survivors had gone, videographers, and said to them, record every testimony you can of Holocaust survivors. And he has some 50,000 plus video recording of survivors in a vault somewhere in California. And he says, you're right, the only way I ever got to see Gita, Lali's wife, was in watching the 2-hour Shoah videotape that she made. Lali made one too, but hey, I had the guy. I could sit and talk to him about it. But watching Gita was how I was able to see the woman and to be able to get a grasp of how she spoke, to be able to write her story. It's quite interesting that their son made the comment to me one day when he read the first draft of the screenplay I wrote. How did you get my mother so well when you never met her? Well, of course, from Lali, but also from watching her on the Shoah tape. Now, Livy made a Shoah tape. Sibby made a Shoah tape. With Sibby, I couldn't sit and watch hers and get from her story because it's all in Hebrew. So I did get it translated, of course, and then I sat and watched her still because I needed to see her body language to be able to describe her. So thank you, Steven Spielberg. Thank you, Thomas Keneally, for writing in the first place that wonderful book. The Shoah Foundation, folks, we owe it a lot.
Now, you mentioned before, that you had the guy, you spoke to Lale, and that's something I wanted to ask you about too, because in Silke's journey, you didn't have the gal, yet you had some of the girls in Three Sisters. There's some similarities with Lale and the sisters in that they didn't really tell their story even to members of their own family until they were, in very advanced years. And then really they chose you as the person to tell their stories to. And the family members found out more about their parents' Holocaust experience really from the experience of what they told you. Did they share a sort of similar, I guess, an unburdening in some way when Lale chose to tell his story to you and the sisters chose to trust you as well to tell their story too?
Yeah, and I actually get it. And I think any parent in particular out there would get it, that they hadn't shared very much about their survival. How could you look into the eyes of your children and in any way tell them of the horrors that you had endured, witnessed, and experienced? I couldn't do it. So, of course, they hadn't done it either. It's like there's a safety net in telling a stranger, even though, I didn't stay a stranger to Lale. And for those first many months that I was seeing him 2 or 3 times a week, he was only telling me his story very clinically and factually. The sisters seemed to get on board with me quite a lot quicker than that. But yes, you're quite right. There were many, many things that Lale and Gita's son, the 3 sisters' children, learned from having their parents now talk to me. I'm so grateful to them that they've allowed this to happen.
Can you tell us about some of those things in relation to the 3 sisters? Because a couple of them were quite powerful things that were really unknown within the family. But I'd love to hear you tell it, not me.
Yeah, look, there of course were the sheer magnitude of the evil that they had actually survived. They had these children, they had all been brought up in Israel because they'd all been born there. Sibi had 2 boys, Magda had 2 girls, and Livy had a boy and a girl. So they knew the story of the Holocaust because they'd been surrounded by all their lives. But the actual evil that their parents, they tell me that they probably didn't want to think about their parents in that place anyway. But there were a couple of things that started coming out when Livy and Magda were talking and sharing things with me, that for their children was the first time they were hearing it. All these 3 girls married and had children. What the children of both Sibi and Magda did not know was that their fathers had had previous families. That both of them, their fathers, had had wives and children who did not survive. So for them to learn that they'd had this whole family of their father that they did not know existed, which they are now trying to look into and find other relatives connected to them, it comes as a real shock to them. But they're also very, very grateful because they now know that there are maybe other family out there that they can go looking for. My researcher in Branoff, in their hometown, she was going through the births, deaths, and marriages in the local sort of town hall area. This is all written down in books, by the way. It's not computerized. They're still in Slovakia. Come on, guys, get with the times. But she was contacting me while she was looking at this information, confirming dates and addresses. And names, the names. Here's one. I had to ring up Livy and say to her, Livy, what's your name? This is a woman well into her 90s when I was writing it, and have her say to me, well, it's Livia, but my family and you call me Livy. And I said, do you have another name? And she went, no, I'm on WhatsApp video with her, okay, folks, I can see her. And her daughter's there with her. And I said, so if I said the name Esther to you, what would you say? She went, yeah, that's my name. I'm Esther. So something as simple as her name being Esther and her daughter going, what are you talking about? Yes. And so I now have been able to get from the Slovakian authorities a birth certificate for her, giving her real name, which is Esther. And then I got another call about a couple of an hour later from Slovakia. And it was my researcher saying, do you want to know about the 4th sister? I went, back up. What do you mean 4th sister? She said, I found a 4th sister. She gave me the details of what she'd uncovered. And again, another phone call to Tel Aviv. And the family had no idea that there had been a 4th sister. And of course, I found this out as the book was actually finished being written. Thanks to COVID, I could not get into Slovakia and do this research sooner. But yeah, a little girl, she'd been born 3 months after their father had died. And she died at just over 3 years of age from tuberculosis. And when the girl's children asked her, why didn't you talk about her? Who was the media? Libby got quite angry and sort of said, she's our baby sister. And when I asked, well, why haven't you told us about her? Have you forgotten about her? She apparently snapped and she said, never. Magda and I say her name every day. They hadn't wanted them to know that there had been this fourth sister, that it was just too much of a burden for them. So yes, it gets interesting.
I'd like to talk about how interesting it can get and that burden, because finding out, for adult children to find out that their father had a pre-life before, their imagination, and that they have, a half sibling who perished in the Holocaust. What was the impact on the adult children? Because obviously all adult children who are children of survivors have a unique experience because their parents, are certain ways because of their experience. But what sort of new level did this add for the adult children and their understanding of what had really happened to their family in the Holocaust?
Well, they accepted the previous wife and children perished during the Holocaust, but they're now looking into what was his first wife's name and what was her family background, and are there family of hers who has survived, so that they're now going on a journey to try and uncover, are there family out there connected to our father that we can now try and track down?
I asked you before, we're skipping over so many things because you've always got so many stories, but I asked you before about sort of the idea of unburdening for Lale and the sisters in finally telling their story. And I've heard you talk before about describing Lale as, obviously there's no denying it was a weight that just doesn't disappear, but you did describe him as kind of having a bit of a spring in his step, once he had shared the story and he was, he could finally open up. Did you see that in the sisters too?
Not so much as Magda. Magda doesn't speak very much English. She understands more than she speaks. And so everything that I hear from her and when I'm with her comes from one of her daughters generally, or Livy, translating to make sure that I get it right. So it's not so obvious with Magda. She's just this most beautiful, kind, gentle, sweet woman. She is. You can see that this woman at 98 is the same as she was, just as a young 16-year-old girl. With Livy, yes, there has been, and their family say that there's been a release of some of the trauma and the pain that she's carried with her for decades and decades. The story's out there, and something happened after the book got printed, and actually before it was even released, we got some printed copies, and we sent it to the family. And Livy finally picked up one of the books just after the book came out and thought, oh, I'm going to read it. She hadn't read it. She'd read the manuscript, but seeing it in a book that other people can go and buy in all these countries. And she got the book and she started reading it. And the next day her daughter found her and she was a bit of a mess. She hadn't slept. She was distraught. And she said she'd stopped reading after the third chapter, and she was now wondering, what have I done? What have we done in sharing this story? And it was very, very traumatic for her. And her family were trying to settle her down, and her granddaughter stopped by and they told her what was wrong with her grandmother. She hadn't slept. And this is a woman of 96. And her granddaughter, she had a laptop with her. She went and opened the laptop and she said, look, Emma, they call her Emma, that's the grandmother word, Hebrew word for grandmother. And she said, look at these. And she showed Livy reviews of the book, comments from ordinary readers of the book in many countries and how it had impacted them. And she looked and she said, these people say it's making a difference to them reading about me, that they have a story or they know somebody in their family in the Holocaust. And all I can say is that Livy now has done a total about face on how she feels about her book. She wanted it written, don't get me wrong, it would never have ever been printed if she hadn't supported it. But seeing it in print and holding it in her hand, it did come as a shock to her. But she's very, very happy now.
And tell us about that moment in your own life with this book in particular. What's it like for you to see it in print finally and know that this story is being told? And where do you want it to sit in the sort of canon of books that are about this moment in history?
Yeah, the book would never have seen the light of day if the family hadn't approved the manuscript of it. It was very important to me that they saw it in a pretty good draft manuscript stage, and all adult members of the family, and that's 3 generations, by the way, because there are adult grandchildren, that they approved or corrected anything that was in it. And what went out was what the whole family, and there was a lot of them, folks, had to agree to. And they did. Yeah. For me, my responsibility was to them, not to any reader, not to any historian or academic, about telling the story of the Holocaust. I have written an account of the Holocaust as told to me by the families of the Mala sisters.
Absolutely.
There's my responsibility. That's where it begins and ends. Where does it sit? Well, you know, who knows? Time will tell. It's fairly new and still coming out in many countries. I just hope that readers will appreciate the bravery, the resilience and the courage of these young girls. And that anyone who reads not only my stories like this, but others, and think about, my gosh, look what they did to survive, that they do not judge them for what they did to survive. That's a lesson that I think comes not only about reading people's stories, but everybody we meet, everybody we know, the stranger we even sit next to on a bus. Do not judge, guys. Don't judge. We don't get to do that.
Now, I said at the start that I did want to talk a little bit about each of your books, and we have discussed The Tattooist, obviously, a little bit, less so Silka's. So I'd like to talk about that a little bit more now, but also just to talk further about how the books stitch together, because obviously when you were writing The Tattooist as a screenplay and then it became a novel, it was not your intention at that point to write a trilogy, although obviously some people now are calling these 3 works that do have such obvious links and connections even between the characters and their interactions and the way their own paths cross, they're calling it a trilogy. So what can you tell us about how each book stands individually, how they fit together? And especially I'd like to hear about Silka's, because obviously you know, that's focused on a female story, and by virtue of the 3 sisters, so is this latest work of yours.
My publishers tell me that if you're going to write a trilogy and call it a trilogy, you generally have got that predetermined before you write book 1, so that you then can actually write a trilogy or connect it. I only got a 1-book deal when I was writing Lali's story. I didn't know that I'd ever get a chance to write another story. I peppered his book with Silka because I had made a promise to Lali, just like the sisters promised their father. I made several promises to Lali, and one of them was that I would tell Silka's story, the story of the bravest person, and he would wag his finger and say, not the bravest girl, the bravest person he ever knew, and she had saved his life. She was responsible for him spending 60 years with the woman he loved, and now being with me. So yes, Silka. The books stand alone. They do. But of course there's a connection. There's a connection between Lali and Silka because he wanted her story told. And by the way, it's only thanks to incredible readers who contacted my publishers and said to them after Lali's story came out, tell me more about Silka. What happened to Silka? I'm Googling Silka and I can't find out anything. So they had to say to me, well, we better give you another book deal. So I got another book deal. But the 3 sisters, of course, aren't mentioned in either of those 2 because I did not know they existed. But guess what, folks? They knew Lali. They knew Lali and Gita. Gita used to come to Israel and stay with Magda. They kept in touch with each other all their lives until Gita died. They knew all about her. They knew Lali had been the person who had tattooed their numbers on their arms, first 2. So the connection with them, of course, brings into Silka and Lali. They, of course, knew Silka. Silka, every morning, was standing 10 feet away from them outside block 25. They were in block 21. They were right side by side. And they would see this lonely 16-year-old girl just standing there. It's one of those lovely little stories that Livy told me of how she was angry with Silka because she didn't go to work, whereas she and everyone in block 21 were being carted off to go to work. And Silka, she looked better than they did, and she was wearing proper clothes. And she said to her, but she always looked so lonely. She said she looked so sad and lonely because no other girl spoke to her. No one went near her. So she asked Sibby one day, she said, can we go and talk to Silka? Look how lonely she is. And Sibby said, no, we can't. We can't be seen with her. And when she said, well, why doesn't she go to work? We have to work all day, and look at us. We're broken, and she's not. And Sibby said to her, well, she has to stay here. Why does she have to stay in her block? She asked her. Well, she has to be there so that the commandant knows where she is. Which I said to her, well, why does the commandant want to know where she is? He said, so she can come to her. He said, why? So this is a 16-year-old girl, okay? Well, she's 16, she said, by this stage, pestering her big sister. And Sibby said to her, well, he needs to know where she is because he comes to her for sex. And Sibby said, I looked at Sibby and I went, what sex? She was so young, so innocent and naive. She didn't even know what her big sister was saying to her.
Yeah, she was the same age as Silka, really, wasn't she?
Yeah, just a little bit younger.
Yeah.
Only a few months.
And so you mentioned before that, Lale, it took him a while, I guess, to tell him your story, and the stories from the sisters seem to come more freely. Do you think that's a female to female thing, or something just that women are more open with their emotions? Why is it that you think the story seemed easier for them to tell you?
They tell me, and I've got to believe them. It's because I had written Lali's story, and I had told his story, and they knew his story. They were there. They were friends of Lali and Gita's for the rest of their lives. So because to them, I had faithfully told their story, they had that trust in me a lot sooner. They knew that they hoped that they could trust me now to tell their story the same way. And that was important to them. Tell it the same way you wrote Lali's, use the same language, the same style of writing, because that way people can relate to it and understand it. So there was an element of that, and maybe the female thing wasn't played into it as well. But I think it was a case of, I'd done right by Lali. And I always said to them up front, if I'm going to do this, then the book will only ever be published when you 100% agree with every word in it.
Now, I'm hoping that people in the audience might have some questions that they would love to ask of you, and we'll get to those in a minute. But now is the time, now is my little prompt to say to everybody, put your fingers on the keyboard or your device, however you're watching this, and send a question to Heather, and you can hear her answer direct to you. You might have a question about her writing life in general, or Three Sisters, or any one of the books. So please do send questions, and I'll come to them in just a few moments after I squeeze in a couple more of my own, because we've talked a lot about, I guess, connections, sliding door moments, things that happened in your life, the way that the stories have come to you. But there were also threads within the stories themselves. And I guess in a way, sliding doors moments in the lives of the characters, the real life people. They were here, they should have been there, they were there, they should have been here, something happened, someone crossed their path. Hope and resilience are obviously threads that run through the books. What can you tell us about some of those moments in Lale's life, or in Silka's life, or of course the Three Sisters, the book that we're focusing on tonight, and how just being in a certain place at a certain time changed the course of that person's history and chance of survival in some cases too?
Yeah, look, every survivor I've met in the many countries I've been lucky to visit and meet them, every single one of them credit only one thing with their survival: being lucky. That's the key word here, folks. Lucky. Lucky that when you arrived in Auschwitz and you stood in front of that person wearing a white coat, who may be in a bad mood, who may be hungover, the weather may be terrible, but one person every single day was deciding the fate in a split second whether you lived or died, was a flick of a wrist to the left or the right, determined whether or not you got to see the sun come up the next day, or you didn't. So it was all about that luck in that one pivotal moment. It sounds crazy, doesn't it? But there really was nothing any person who entered that hellhole could do to influence their fate, not at that point in time. So it's lucky. Now with Lully, for him to be surviving, it wasn't lucky to get typhoid, but he did. Where the sliding door moment for him happened in getting the role of being Tatavera was him being taken out by the SS and thrown onto a death cart to be taken away to die because he was unconscious. And one man in his block, knowing he wasn't quite dead, thinking he could save him. In the words of the other men in that block, to save one is to save mankind. Now, when he went to drag Lully off that death cart, off those bodies he was lumped on top of, Pepin, the tattooist, at the time was walking past and saw it, and he helped. So Pepin came into Lully's life, though Lully didn't know it, for another week when Pepin came to him and subsequently asked him to work with him. That he had an SS guard who Lully describes as an uneducated oaf, made responsible for him in the role he had as the tattooist, the Tatavera. Again, these things they kind of just happen. There was nothing you can do to predict a lot of them. The Gita knew Silke, so that when Lully was then put into prison in Auschwitz, he was able to get the message to Silke, this is where I am, what can you do? And she made that decision. The only time she told Gita, many, many, many years later, the only time she ever asked the commandant of Birkenau, who was raping her, whenever he felt the need, that she asked him for something, save Lully.
And for the three sisters, what were some of those moments in their own lives and survival through this experience?
Yeah, part of the survival we've worked out of the Slovakian girls that, I know many of these Slovakian girls who were survivors, considering they were the very first Jewish people taken into Auschwitz, Slovakian girls, end of March 1942. There was one really, really nasty, evil, horrible SS woman in Birkenau. She was the camp commandant for the females. She kind of looked out for Livy. Livy was this tiny little thing. By the way, she survived one winter because her sister went into the building where all the clothes and belongings of the incoming prisoners were and found a baby's bonnet. And she covered her head at it at night, a baby's bonnet. That's how tiny she was. This evil, horrible person kind of took a bit of a shine to Livy and looked out for her. By the way, that same evil person probably was responsible for not only the girls, but a lot of other Slovakian prisoners, female prisoners surviving at all. Because she made a call, about 18 months, 2 years after, that the Slovakian girls, the low numbers they were referred to, they only have 4 numbers on their arm. Livy, Silke, Sibi, Gita, that the low numbers had been there so long that they no longer should be subjected to the daily selection, the selection to go to the gas chamber. So once again, having a low number helped them survive. This woman, by the way, there was nothing else really nice about her. She was subsequently, in the back of the book, I give you a link to her details about her. She was subsequently hung so evil were her behaviour. That when Magda was brought into Auschwitz-Birkenau, only she meant to stay there for 24 hours en route to another camp, that a Slovakian girl thought she recognised her and found Sibi and told Sibi, I think I've seen Magda. And nothing, no one, no place, nothing was going to stop Sibi getting to where her sister was and finding her. There are many of them. They're scattered throughout the book, and guess what? They are all happened. They are all, as the girls have told me. That one particular SS officer who, when the girls got separated in January 45, Magda's back in Birkenau now, Sibi and Livy are in Auschwitz. And they asked her, bring us our sister. She brought her in a car, opened the door and said, here's your jewel. So Magda has the nickname, the jewel, by the way, with her family.
Now, my last question before I go and see if there are questions from the audience, and I have seen one definitely pop up. I wanted to hook into that word luck that you mentioned, because, you know, it is luck in a way that this happened or that didn't happen. And for some people who survive something really terrible because of luck, they can either hold on to that luck and let luck guide them and they're a lucky person and they're positive, or they can feel eternal guilt that why were they lucky? Why wasn't everybody else lucky? What was it about the sisters and Lale, I guess, that made them go to the positive side, do you think?
Oh, you know, they all did have guilt at different degrees. Every survivor's got guilt, but it manifests itself differently depending on the person. With regard to the girls' life after Auschwitz, by the way, they contributed to making their own luck. They made decisions about how they were wanting to live their life, which included leaving Slovakia after they got back there and moving to Israel, that's where they had their families. And by the way, folks, there's a lovely end to the story of the sisters in Israel. And I don't end it at the end of the Holocaust. I take you back to their home and then subsequently to Israel. And there you can read about an incredible friendship that existed between the maid, Livia, and the first president of the state of Israel and the first lady. And that's a story possibly that should be told in its own right. So yes, you get lucky, but then sooner or later, you've got to start trying to make your own luck. Isn't that the case with all of us in our lives?
I think so, 100%. And obviously they've got family around them and a very loving and supportive family. Which I guess is very important too. Now, lovely people at the Latrobe Library, I saw at least one question pop up. Are there more in the chat, or could we just start with that one question and hopefully other people may have them, or I can keep asking Heather my own questions?
Why don't you go with the question you've got there, and then while you're doing that and looking at it, I'm going to say g'day to Gav, who's joined us. I can now see up on the screen. Hi, darling.
So there's one question. Thanks,
Hi,
Claire.
sorry.
So for Heather, given your 3 books may be seen as a trilogy, is there a potential for them to be made into a feature film?
Thank you for your question. The answer to that, it's not yes or no, because Lale's story is already in development to be a 6-part miniseries. So not feature film, but miniseries for television. So you don't have to leave your home to watch it. And there's been some advances on the development in that and the production of that, which hopefully will become common knowledge soon. But of course, COVID kind of got in the way of that, didn't it? The filming of that. But that's now back on track, and there's going to be some wonderful announcements hopefully made soon by the makers of that. With regard to the other 2 stories, well, let's just wait and see what kind of job they do with Lale's.
So tell us about the involvement that you've had in the script, if any, because obviously a screenplay was obviously very dear to your heart at the start, because that's how the whole story started for you, writing it as a screenplay. Now here it is going to get on the small screen.
Yeah, gosh, how arrogant of it was me to think that I could write a screenplay and something that would get made into a film. I am no screenwriter, folks. I did learn how to write it. I did write Lale's story in that format. The great thing about learning to write screenplays is that that comes with a formula and it comes with rules. And so you follow the rules and you get a story from A to Z, 1, 2, 3 acts. I am the script consultant, so I do have a say. 3 screenwriters, professional screenwriters, have written the 6 episodes. They each wrote 2. And it sounds weird that different people can write the same characters and write a screenplay and have 3 input. But I am the script consultant, and yes, believe me, there have been more than once or twice or 10 times when I've written back and said, no, back up, guys, can't do that. And of course, they respect what I say. They listen to what I say and try and tell me that, look, we're being creative here. This is all about a different medium to a book. And I went, that's fine. But hey, you don't get to mess with the timeline of Auschwitz. And you don't get to mess with the personality of those people who are dear to me.
Now, on that, and I will give people in the audience a prompt to come on and send a question to Heather. This is your chance, but I'll squeeze in one more while we're waiting. I've seen just one pop up now. I'm interested in, your input now as script consultant and making sure that everything stays on track and authentic to the story as it was written in your mind. But I'm wondering what input you have from the people that you talk with when the book is in its draft stages before it goes to publication. Did the three sisters, or two of the sisters in this case, come and say, oh no, you can't put that bit in? Or are they involved at that level? Or do they trust you completely and say, whatever you come up with is fine with us and we'll see it after it's in print?
No, they never they didn't want to read any of it until it was finished. And that's when the manuscript got sent to the families and they all had a chance to read it and comment. There was only one thing that I got pulled up on, one thing, because spending so much time with them, and I was able to make repeat trips to Israel and lots of Zoom talks and whatnot. There was only one element of the manuscript when it came back to me, the comments, other than, oh, you spelt such and such name wrong. But there was one thing, and that was my description of the girls' return to Prague. And I got pretty angry when I was writing this. And rule number one, when you're telling somebody else's story, don't get involved emotionally. You cannot in any way let your emotions affect your writing. You're telling their story. Hone in on the emotions that they had telling it to you. So I knew when I was writing these scenes that I was getting carried away, but I tried it anyway. But it came back to me from Livy, you got it wrong. You got it so wrong. I had written their return to Prague in a very negative way. I was angry that these young Slovakian survivors were welcomed back to Prague in 1945 with a huge turnout, thousands of people cheering them and being welcomed in Westminster Square by the mayor and welcomed home. And to me, it was, how dare they think that they can welcome them back as if nothing happened when they were the ones responsible for them being sent away in the first place. They are responsible for them having no home and family to come back to. And that's the tone I wrote those scenes in. Well, Livy put me in my place, didn't she? Well and truly, you got it wrong. And I said, tell me what to do. And she said, you must remember, it was the happiest day of our life because we did come home. We did come home. Now, while home subsequently didn't work out for them, the fact that she still, all these decades later, remembers that arrival back in Prague is the happiest day of the girls' lives is wonderful. So I rewrote it and you get to read her version of it.
Now, I have seen another couple of questions pop up, which is brilliant timing because that will probably take us right through to the scheduled end of this event. So can we hear those questions?
Yes. So the first one is, what are your writing routines? Do you write at a certain time of the day? Do you listen to music? Read to find the right headspace? Sorry.
Oh, thank you. My publishers would say with regard to my writing style is that I'm undisciplined. I do not structure my writing. The one thing I do, by the way, folks, so these stories are based on real people and real times in history. And I follow the advice that I read many, many, many years ago of a screenwriter in the US who, when writing similar stories, wrote, research, research, research. Now throw the bloody research away and write the thing. And so, yes, when it does come time to writing, I have no paperwork in front of me, no notes, no nothing, no second screen with notes on it. I sit and I just write from up here, because if I don't have it up here, how can I possibly get it on the screen for you? I'm not that clever, okay? I'm not that clever, and I'm no author who writes literature and can create things. So it has to be up there. So my writing style, by the way, it is mostly at night because I'm undisciplined, I'm easy distracted. Somebody brings me up and says, do you want to have coffee instead of working? I will jump at it every chance I get. I've found that I'm a night owl. Well, I've actually always known that. And writing from about 9 p.m. to 2 or 3 in the morning is what works for me. And with regard to music, there are 1 or 2 pieces of music that I always listen to every time I start to write these stories. It's the same piece of music. It is the most hauntingly beautiful, tragic, but my gosh, does it put me in the mood. It's written by a Polish man called Gorecki, Gorecki. And the name of the piece of music is from a symphony he wrote, a symphony called Songs of the Sorrowful. And I just listened to symphony number 3. It goes for 7 minutes, just over. And absolutely, that's how I get in my headspace. Check it out. It is stunningly, tragically beautiful.
Thank you for that insight. I think there was one more question that I saw pop up.
Yeah, there's one more. Have you met other people along your journey of your books that may inspire you to write another story? And when you travel as part of your research, do you have to fund yourself?
First, I'll answer it in the way it was written. I find so many people, I hear so many stories, some of them that are all amazing. You know, I was talking down in Frankston just last week with Claire, and one of the women coming up, I was in person there, and this lovely lady came up to me. She's 90 years of age, and she told me, well, she handed me a card and said, read this when you leave. But she did tell me that she grew up in London as a young girl during the war, and how her family, her parents, had fostered 7 children who were part of what's called the Kindertransport. And these were young boys and girls who were smuggled out of parts of Austria and the Netherlands and smuggled to London and fostered out to families, Jewish children. And how at the end of the war, 6 of the 7 found their parents or family members back in their home country, and one boy hadn't. Leo Kaufman, his name is. Margaret, I don't know if you're watching this, but Margaret told me about this. He then became, of course, her stepbrother, and his story. And then she gave me this letter, which I read when I got back to my hotel room, detailing more. So these come to me all the time. There's 1 or 2 which are going to be written and published by my publishers in London, that are written by other people. So powerful are they. So little time do I have. As you can see, I'm getting on, that they are still being picked up by ghostwriters with my publishers and will be told. So yes, that happens. Now, you wanted to know about
the other part of the question, and then I'll...
Other part of the question, look, I'm lucky now, folks, that when I want to research, that I have publishers who, for the most part, fund my research, my travels, and meeting all these wonderful people.
Now, a lovely way to end tonight's talk, because you've been so generous with your stories, is about maybe bringing the community in, about the power of sharing stories and storytelling. So that's a lovely segue for you to tell us a little bit about the Stories of Hope project and how people who feel like they have stories maybe could reach out to you and your publisher.
Yeah, this is something that, well, the book I wrote came out just over a year ago. It came about primarily because of the pandemic, but it was something my publishers had mentioned to me just prior to it, when they asked me, how is it you get people to talk to you? You know, I hadn't been asked that pointedly before. My initial, of course, my obvious reaction was, well, because I listen to them. How do you know to listen, they asked. I said, well, my great-grandfather told me to listen, to shut up and listen if I want to learn anything, to shut up and listen if I want somebody to tell me something about themselves. So Stories of Hope, the book, is based on my learning to listen and how I then translated that into the books I've got, and how I used that, of course, in my life, working at Monash Medical Centre for 20 years in the social work department, where, trust me, folks, the people I met there every day who I was meeting because something tragic or traumatic had happened to them, they were not there to hear me. I was there to listen to them. As a result of the book, and from the many, many emails that started coming our way, I do have a separate website called Stories of Hope. And on there, we invite people who have a story, short story, however long it can be, 2 pages, 20, we don't care. If you want to write a story that is in some ways emotionally impacting on you, then you can, and you can submit it to my publishers in London, and hundreds of people around the world have done that. And the majority of them, they say, was just cathartic to do that, to write it. It goes to publishers in London, and we then offer those writers, do you want some editorial help to write the story maybe polish it up. You may want to enter it into a competition. You may want to do something else with it. And so they get free editorial help to polish up their stories. And we will ultimately, with those who are approving, release those stories. Some want them to be released to the public, others don't, and we respect that.
Well, that's definitely a lovely way to end, and people should check that out online, and maybe they have a story within their own family that they feel like they'd like to share, maybe get some help. So thank you for that. Thank you again, Heather Morris, the wonderful Heather Morris. So we've been talking about your 3 novels, The Tattooist of Auschwitz, Silke's Journey, and the new one, 3 Sisters. And obviously the other book you mentioned, Stories of Hope, is non-fiction, where you share a little bit about the insights of how you write, how you listen, and how people can listen and tell stories in their own lives. Thank you to everyone who's joined us this evening. And thank you, of course, to the library who made this possible. We can't always get to regional libraries, but online makes it possible. And Heather's coming to us all the way from Queensland, and wherever you are tonight. Hope you've enjoyed it, and thank you again.
And thank you, Claire. Claire and I go back a long way. We've been doing this a while, and I just am so grateful for her for the time that she does and spending time with me, and never tire of looking at her beautiful face and never tire of talking with her.
Oh, well, I'm never going to get sick of you talking like that either, lady, but thank you. And library people, did you want to
thank you, Kylie.
I just wanted to say thank you again to Heather and Claire. It was a fantastic evening, and just remind people, if you're not a member of either Latrobe City, East Gippsland or West Gippsland libraries, please sign up, support our library services. The more memberships, it helps us with our resourcing. And you'll receive a feedback form along with the recording very shortly. So thank you again to Heather and Claire.
Brilliant advice, because books change lives. Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Thank you so much. Good night.